Around 5 years ago, at an Egyptian university, an event was held by the female members of an Islamic student society. There was supposed to be a buffet prepared for the occasion. The male students of the society were supposed to provide the food and drinks for the buffet. Sadly, the event started and ended without any buffet because the girls thought that no food or drinks had actually been provided. What happened was that the guys had prepared the food and drinks for the buffet as promised beforehand, but had placed it somewhere that was not obvious, and they were uncomfortable talking to the girls, so they had not communicated with the female members of the society in order to coordinate this setup, resulting in the mix-up that occurred. All of this happened because these young men were unaware of the proper Islamic etiquette in relations between both genders. Sadly, regarding this issue, one finds that people are either too easygoing or too strict. On one hand, you find people who see there is no difference between young men and women and that they can engage in all sorts of activities together without any reservations or boundaries. On the other hand, you find those who are extremely strict in these matters, and it almost seems like they wish some spaceship could take all the females on Earth and send them to another planet. But God created both males and females on one planet, and He asked us to cooperate together and deal with each other within certain boundaries of propriety and decorum. Islamic etiquette between both sexes is only one part of the larger and more encompassing structure of Islamic societal sexual education. In other words, God educates society as a whole in matters related to modesty and interaction between both sexes. The absence of this whole educational process leads to a collapse of the moral framework of society with pervasion of the phenomena like sexual harassment, rape, and even diminished productivity at work because some youth may be unable to concentrate at work since they have certain needs that are not met. There are many factors in society that help in ensuring that both genders know how to interact with each other properly. One of these is proper education from childhood, meaning that from an early age, girls and boys should be taught how to deal with each other. Another factor that helps promote proper relations between both genders is early marriage. We must help young people to get married early. Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, "Whoever can afford to get married should do so." If a young man or a young woman is mature and is financially capable of getting married, what is the problem with allowing them to get married? Unfortunately, there is a lot of inflexibility regarding this idea, and there are attempts to raise the minimum age of marriage, which can have negative effects on society. Starting from childhood, there should be properly supervised gatherings between boys and girls. Such gatherings should be supervised by trained educators or older family members so that young boys and girls can learn from an early age how to interact with propriety. Islamic etiquettes of interaction includes certain rules that apply to both males and females, and other rules that apply to females only. One of the important stipulations for gatherings involving both sexes is that the event be a serious one, such as organizing an educational or religious event or preparing a certain project at college, but not parties where both sexes will be mingling together and dancing and so on. Certainly, girls can have their own parties where they can have a good time and dance, and guys can also have their own fun events as well. Another point is that during any mixed gatherings, there should not be any improper behavior, flirtation, or use of vulgar words such as the F word that people use nowadays very freely. Some young people consider this word a part of everyday language. Everybody is using that word freely, so why can't we? How can such a word be a part of everyday language? The Prophet, peace be upon him, said, "None of you should be a blind follower. If people do good, he does good too. And if they do bad, he does the same." In other words, he wants to say, don't be a puppet. Why shouldn't every person have a character of his or her own? Another thing that should be avoided in mixed gatherings is engaging in frivolous talk, meaningless things and nonsense, just to kill time. They should have a worthy issue to discuss, and they should also avoid backbiting. Of course, backbiting is prohibited under any circumstances, but it tends to become very prevalent during mixed gatherings. Boys tend to talk about other boys, and girls tend to talk about other girls behind their backs in order to portray themselves at an advantage and look cool. This sort of behavior is so so obnoxious that God said it was like eating your dead brother's flesh. Another important point is to avoid showing off and bragging. In the presence of girls, guys are inevitably tempted to brag and show off their looks, their watches, their cars, and so on in order to impress the girls present. Having said that, this doesn't mean we have to be overly solemn and serious throughout such gatherings. Certainly there can be some fun, but without profanities, without lewd or flirtatious behavior or any sexual innuendos. We have examples of light-hearted yet proper interaction between men and women from the days of the Prophet and his companions. Umar ibn al-Khattab, the well-known companion of the Prophet, peace be upon him, once went to his daughter and found her sitting with a friend of hers. He asked her who she was, so she answered that she was Asma, the daughter of Umais. So he said, "Oh, you mean that Abyssinian woman, that seafaring woman?" Of course, she was neither Abyssinian nor was she a sailor, but he knew that she was one of those Muslims who had previously immigrated to Abyssinia, which is Ethiopia today, and had done so on a boat at a time when sea travel was very rare for Arabs. So he meant to say, "Oh, that woman who has actually been to sea." Now, the immigration to Abyssinia by some Muslims had taken place before the immigration of many others, including Umar himself, to Medina. So Asma looked at Umar and said, "We are the ones who immigrated before you guys," meaning we are the pioneers of immigration for the sake of our religion. Umar then answered, "Yes, but our immigration included the Prophet." So even back then, light-hearted conversation between men and women was acceptable as long as it was done with propriety. Another point is, in mixed gatherings, men and women should lower their gaze and avoid unnecessary eye contact, especially with lust. God says in Surah An-Nur, the chapter of the Quran named The Light, "Tell the believing men to lower their gaze and to protect their private parts. That is purer for them, and Allah is aware of all that they do." And tell the believing women to lower their gaze and to protect their private parts, and so on. The expression of protect their private parts has been interpreted in general to mean protect themselves from falling into adultery or fornication, except in this verse. Ibn Abbas said, here in particular it means to cover those parts which should be covered. Men and women should cover the parts they are ordered to cover to protect them from being seen by others. This is because lowering one's gaze is linked to protecting the privacy of one's body. Every person should lower his or her gaze to avoid invading the privacy of others' bodies and should protect the privacy of his or her own body from being invaded by the gaze of others. So in this verse, Allah has instructed us to cover our private parts, yet He still tells us to lower our gaze from that which is apparent. This means that even to look at the apparent parts of a person in a lustful manner is inappropriate. A woman's face and hands are not required to be covered, but all the same, no man should stare unnecessarily or with lust even at a woman's face or hands. And there is a story related to that. One day, a handsome young man called Al-Fadl ibn al-Abbas was riding behind the Prophet, peace be upon him, on his camel. Then a very pretty woman with rosy cheeks came up to the Prophet to ask him something. The young man could not take his gaze off her, so the Prophet turned the young man's face away with his own hand. He actually did that 3 times in order to prevent him from staring at her. Note that this man was just looking at a face, but staring should be avoided even at parts that are apparent. Islamic etiquette also involves avoiding shaking hands between males and females, and that makes sense. If men and women are forbidden from gazing at each other unnecessarily, then it makes sense that they should not touch unnecessarily as well. There is a well-known story about the Prophet. When he met a group of women who had come to pledge their allegiance to him, he did not shake hands with them and said, "I do not shake hands with women." And having accepted the allegiance from one woman of your group means that goes for all of you. However, this does not mean that shaking hands between men and women is actually forbidden. The reason that in Islam men and women do not shake hands, except if married or close relatives, of course, is that they are emulating the Prophet's traditions. But to go so far as to say that it's a sin would require that there be a text that actually says, do not do so and so, or steer clear from so and so. And the reason I say this is that some people tend to take this too extremely. I remember that once when I was in the United States, I had gone with a friend to make arrangements for renting a campsite in order to hold an Islamic camp. The manager of the campsite that we were talking to was a 70-year-old woman. She put out her hand to shake ours, so I shook her hand, but my companion refused to do so and said, "I do not shake hands with women." I was really very embarrassed because I had been hoping that we could interest this nice old lady in witnessing our event and getting a chance to hear some of the talks we would be giving. Maybe we could even have invited her to embrace Islam. But now, after embarrassing her like that and giving her the impression that the Muslim men despise women, how could we ask her to listen to anything about Islam? Nowadays, many overzealous young men who have recently become religious refuse to shake the hands of female acquaintances, even if they are middle-aged women like an uncle's wife whom they used to shake hands with before. So the obvious impression they give is that piety has caused them to become rude. These are examples of embarrassing situations where some people tend to be too strict without due cause. There is actually a lot of proof that physical contact between men and women is allowed under certain circumstances as long as there is no fear of temptation or seduction. For example, who used to tend to the wounded during the battles of the Muslims in the days of the Prophet? It was the female companions, of course. When these women tended to the wounded, they certainly did not throw the antiseptics and bandages at those men's wounds from far away. There must have been some physical contact, holding their limbs, removing torn clothes, and cleaning their wounds. So there was physical contact as long as it was devoid of inviting temptations. Regarding this issue of touching, some overly strict people like to quote the saying of the Prophet that it is better for a man to be stabbed in his head with a spear than to touch a woman, besides his wife or close relatives, of course. In answer to this, I would like to say that first of all, the Prophet, peace be upon him, never resorted to exaggeration. To say that it is better for a man to be hit in his head with a spear than to literally touch a woman is definitely an exaggeration. Secondly, the word touch in this context actually means having sexual intercourse. In the Quran, for example, when Mary, mother of Jesus, got word that she was going to have a son, she said, "Oh God, how can I have a son when I have not been touched by anyone?" Obviously, she did not mean that she had not been literally touched. She meant that she had not had intercourse. Elsewhere in the Quran, God also says, "But if you were ill or on a journey or came from the call of nature or have touched women and you find no water, then take for yourselves clean sand and rub therewith your faces and hands." Normally, after intercourse, one must have a bath. But if one finds no water, one can do the tayammum as described in the verse. So the term touched women here means intercourse. So after taking that into consideration, one can understand that the saying of the Prophet actually means it is better to be hit with a spear in your head than to fall into adultery or fornication. So there is really no need to be overly strict in this matter. And the reason that Muslim men and women do not shake hands is that the Prophet did not do so. Not because it's a sin, but rather a disliked act. Another point is that men and women should be segregated if there is a fear of crowdedness. Back at the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, the streets of Medina were very narrow like in all old cities. So people were liable to brush against each other as they walked along the streets. For that reason, the Prophet, peace be upon him, proposed that men should walk in the middle of the street while women should walk on the sides in order to avoid unwanted contact. He also said that one of the doors of the mosque should be left for women. And to this day, this door of the Prophet's mosque is called the door of the women. Though men and women at the time of the Prophet used to pray in the same hall. This is much better than men and women crowding through the same door or crowding over an open buffet at any event, allowing unwanted bodily contact. Another important point is that a man and a woman should not be alone in seclusion behind closed doors. The Prophet, peace be upon him, said, "No man and woman should be in seclusion unless there is a mahram or a close relative like a father, a brother, an uncle, and so forth." There should also be avoidance of daily lengthy meetings or interactions between males and females. Supposing, for example, a male and female co-worker are working on a project together. This could entail repeated interaction day in and day out. Here I would suggest that, if feasible, managers should place female employees in one room and males in another. This is much better than repeated daily lengthy interaction between men and women. The danger with such prolonged interaction is that people can develop romantic feelings or sexual feelings for others in these situations. For example, if a man has an argument with his wife in the morning and then goes to work where he spends most of his day with a female colleague who may also be married, and then she asks him sympathetically and attentively, "Is everything all right?" His mind and heart may wander, and the results could be detrimental to both him and her as well as their respective families. Another issue is the avoidance of putting oneself in situations that incite rumors. Supposing a young man and woman are working together on a worthy project, they should not meet in a coffee shop over drinks to do that, because although they are not in seclusion, the image they project may be conducive to rumors of a special relationship between them. So it is better to avoid such situations. This is just one example, and this leads us to the fact that what is considered an inappropriate situation inviting rumors may differ from one community to another. So the culture in a certain society may have an impact to some extent on what is considered inappropriate or appropriate. A good example about avoiding dubious situations is that one day while the Prophet, peace be upon him, was spending a night of worship in the mosque, Lady Safiya, his wife, went to talk to him. As she was leaving, he got up to walk her home. On their way, they encountered two men who, when they saw the Prophet walking in the dark with a woman, decided to walk away quickly to avoid the embarrassment of that situation, as they did not realize that the veiled woman was indeed the Prophet's own wife. However, the Prophet made a point of stopping them and pointing out that this woman was none other than his wife Safiya. They were embarrassed and said, "Would we doubt you, God's messenger?" But he answered that Satan could steal upon anyone and cause him to think ill thoughts. Note here that thinking ill of the Prophet could cause someone to lose his faith. So it was very important for the Prophet to point out the reality of the situation and avoid them having any misconceptions about his behavior. Another point: both men and women should adhere to the Islamic dress code and walk and talk modestly. In relation to women, they should avoid perfume because perfume arouses men. So these are the guidelines that should be observed when men and women interact. Well, what if some of these stipulations are not fulfilled? Should we interact all the same or avoid interaction? Supposing there is a certain student event or an event at work that I really want to attend, but where the ideal Islamic stipulations are not met. Should I attend or shouldn't I? Here one should weigh the pros and cons of each situation. The question should be a matter of what benefits I am likely to gain from attending this event versus the harm that may befall me due to not attending. This is a rather complex issue that falls within the area of jurisprudence or priorities. An example would be if there was a work party where the etiquettes of Islamic interaction were not being met. Yet my absence could cause negative effects to my career. I could in this situation make a brief appearance to give my greetings to the attendees and then leave. I would like to recap by saying that whether we are men or women, God has created us as equals on this earth. He asked us to develop this earth, and so we must cooperate with each other, but within the proper Islamic etiquette. Thank you very much.